Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Jalen, and today I'm discussing all of the books that I read in December. It's a little late, past the midpoint of January, but I realized that I hadn't filmed this yet, so let's hop into it. I read 9 books in December, near the end of the year. I had a little bit of time off. It didn't really sway my reading too much, I would say, but I did read some really good stuff. I had some others that I was a little bit more mixed about, so let's go, let's do this. First up, I read my favorite book of the month, hands down. It's Vladimir by Julia May Jonas. This one comes out on February 1st, so 2 weeks away. I implore you all to read this book. It is such a messy, brainy, intellectual, romp, sexual book. Basically follows this English professor at the small liberal arts college who is quite beloved, but she is married to another professor at the school, and he has been accused of sexual harassment and inappropriate relationships generally with his students. And so you learn that this couple, they have a bit of a mutual understanding about their openness in their marriage, and how our narrator, she knew about her husband's pursuits with his students. And what's really interesting here is a new professor, a young novelist, comes to the college to teach, and our narrator becomes gradually more and more obsessed with him and is yearning for him, and how that all plays out amidst the accusations against her husband, and how that plays out with her desiring this young novelist and whether he's reciprocating it, and also his own marriage. And aside from that, it's really looking at novels and is really smart in the ways that it dissects the ways that our contemporary stories are told, particularly from the lens of like an older woman who is also a novelist, how that kind of plays out amidst this author's first, stab at a novel. This is a debut novel. She has an MFA in playwriting, and so what I really took away from this book too is a lot of like the scene setting here was very, very well done, and it really stood out well in my mind. Like there's so many scenes in this book that really, they stick with you. And I will say, as you watch these relationships kind of come together and apart, and how it all leads up to a huge climax, it's so like it's unputdownable. Like when I started this book, I could not put it down. Like it's, if you want a romp that's also quite intellectual and looking at novels and the state of contemporary literature, while also providing a quite steamy and mysterious, reflective, and quite dark book. I think if you like Ottessa Moshfegh, you'll like this book a lot, because our narrator has some very controversial opinions, particularly around the relationships with her husband, with the student. She kind of thinks that it's the student's fault. And so I will say a book that I recommended highly is in my top 5 of last year, called The Right to Sex. It has an essay in that book called on like not sleeping with your students. Basically, it's all about professor-student relationships, and I think that essay in that book is a perfect pair to read with this book, because it's all about that, and really looking at the ethics and morality of those decisions, and playing into how the narrative also develops here with the relationships and the entanglements. It was just so fun, and I want to read this again because it was just such a blast to read. And this would have been in my top 10, I think, of last year, but I limited it to only books that I read in 2021, so no 2022 galleys. And so this one, put your pre-orders in, put in your request to your library. Like, it's incredible. It is so fun. Loved it. I can definitely see it being in my top 10 this year. Next up, I read my first Elizabeth Strout. I read My Name is Lucy Barton. She is quite famous for the Olive Kitteridge books, but this is the one I started because Matthew Sharapa on Instagram, he kind of like binged the trilogy that this book is in. And so we basically follow this novelist, another novelist, and she is in the hospital, and it's basically like a memoir from this novelist, so it's fiction, but it's like this novelist writing and reflecting on her past when I think she had to get like her appendix out, if I recall correctly, so she's in the hospital, and so it's all like reflecting on this time in her life when her mother comes to visit her in the hospital, and you learn that her mom and her have a very fraught relationship. At the time of her mom visiting her in the hospital, they hadn't seen each other in many, many years, and so you learn more about why the relationship is quite fraught, and about the people back in their town, and how she grew up in poverty, and various struggles that she dealt with, and how that kind of informed her present moment as a novelist, and how she got there in her current marriage. I did really like this one. I was kind of not too blown away by it. I do think her prose is very sharp and quite simple and clean and precise, and I really liked reading that. It's told in like a bunch of very short vignettes, I want to say. It kind of jumps between the present moment, which is her in the hospital, and then reflecting on something in the past, generally like her childhood, and then as she grows up and into her marriages, you learn more about her there and more about her mom. And yeah, I just really liked it. It was very simple. It was simplistic and kind of calm read, which was really, it was good. And I did this also with the audiobook, which is also great. But I will say, I think I would have enjoyed this one. I remember taking a quick break from this book for some reason. I think it was around the holidays or something, but I think this is a book best read like in one sitting or in the least sittings possible, but I liked it. If you've read Elizabeth Strout, let me know. I will be picking up the other two in this trilogy. She has a new one that just came out recently called Oh William that I hear is like the best one of the three, so I'll be continuing with it for sure. Next up, I read Borealis by Aisha, Sabatini, Sloan. This one is interesting. It's a very unique book that I read this year. I can't really think of anything too similar to it. I think if I had to compare it to something, it would be Maggie Nelson. It is a fragmentary look at her and her time in Alaska, and so this is a lot about her reflecting on being queer and black and reflecting on her relationships and also taking in the Alaskan landscape and how that's kind of informing her reflections and some sadness, some depression that's, lurking inside of her and how she is thinking about her past while also reflecting it through modern art. And so she has a lot of references to black artists and how those inform her work. And so it reminded me of Maggie Nelson in the sense that she uses fragments to reflect on the past, kind of similar to Blewitz, I would say. And I really liked it. I would say it didn't stick with me too much. I think sometimes something about these fragmentary books, I tend to be somewhat conflicted on them because I find that sometimes I get quite confused. And I don't know if it is part of the craft of fragmentary style that it kind of leaves you to fill in the gaps between them, or if it's something, because like sometimes I think fragmentary writing can be done extremely well, and I love many books that contain fragments in them, but other ones I tend to find myself when they get a little bit more esoteric or abstract or vague, I think that it can kind of be not my personal cup of tea, but I did really like the unique stance of this book in which we have a black woman in Alaska where there's not many black people around her and reflecting on her relationships amidst nature. And so I think if you like nature writing, if you like when a narrator is kind of like displaced or in a new setting and how that's kind of affecting their examinations, like kind of like Katie Kitamura, she does this a lot in her books. That's fiction though. But yeah, I really liked it. It was an interesting look at art and queerness and black identity amidst Alaskan glaciers, thinking about memory. It was really good and like artsy, and it was good. I liked it. Next up, a book that I was unfortunately quite disappointed by. I'll be making another video about my most disappointing books of 2021. I don't think this is a bad book by any means, but I just had different expectations going into it for some reason, and so it's I Love You, But I've Chosen Darkness by Vaye Watkins. This is a book I think I'm disappointed by it just because this is CJ's one of her favorite books of the year. It just didn't really work for me personally in the way that it's told. So basically this has the makings of everything that I like in a book. It's a dark look at motherhood, and so it's a DWM. It's about a woman who is basically leaving her family to go to Nevada, and she's a writer and she's reflecting on her being an fairly new novelist and generally she basically is suffering from postpartum depression, and so she leaves her family to go to this, I think like a writing conference or something, like she's doing an engagement, a speaking engagement there in Reno, and you see her basically reflecting on her past and her family and wondering whether she is going to go back to her family or whether she's just going to kind of like leave them forever because she's unsure about whether she wants to be a mother. And the things that this book does in terms of structure is quite original, and I really thought it would work for me, but I found by the end of it I was kind of left feeling like I didn't really even read a novel. It just kind of felt like a messy kind of summary of a woman who was thinking about things, but it doesn't really pay off for me. Like that's something I generally like in fiction. Like I love just a thinky, DWM, just a woman that's thinking about stuff, but this one, the ways that she plays with structure and uses her family history and splices it into the narrative didn't really feel like it informed the narrative much beyond just kind of like that surface level examination of her trying to like think about her mom and her sense of motherhood and how it's informing the narrator's sense of motherhood over her newborn child and whether she wants to also be a mother. So one thing that she does in this book is she like interpolates a bunch of letters from her mom to like I think a cousin of hers like back in the 60s or 70s, and so it's a lot about like her mom's teenage like love and angst in these different letters that she wrote. So I think her cousin or her friend or something, and so she randomly puts these into the narrative without really teeing it up at all, but then you realize that it's from her mom, and in the main plot of the story she's reflecting on her mom, and then she adds these, so you think it's going to inform something to the narrative and like learn more about the mom, but really it was just kind of like trivial teenage kind of like nonsense, and it didn't really go anywhere by the end of the book. And there were sections where this was like a huge part of the book, just these different letters that were just like there, and it was just I was left kind of confused by it. I was like, am I missing something with this, given that like the actual narrative here was really intriguing, like seeing this woman that's leaving her family and trying to decide whether she wants to be a mother. Like I love that, and she would just completely do a detour, and I didn't love that. And one thing about her family that's really interesting is that her dad was a part of the Manson family. And so you see her kind of like thinking about how her dad was involved in that and how those family decisions kind of play on her own psyche now. And so I think that all of that stuff was really interesting. If you like books about cults, a cult is very much at the center of this book in terms of the past of the book. Yeah, by the end of it, I think there are some passages here that are just like pure like chef's kiss, DWM examinations of motherhood, of depression, more specifically postpartum depression. And so, yeah, I was just kind of disappointed by it. But I did like the ideas presented. I just didn't think that it worked for me structurally and narratively as a novel. It just didn't really, it wasn't doing it for me. So I am sorry, CJ. I'm still glad that I read it. I think it was a really interesting book, but it just wasn't a fave. Next up, I read The Sentence by Louise Erdrich, and this is my first Louise Erdrich book. She had recently won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction for The Night Watchman, and so my book club actually picked this as the December pick for the month, and I read it for that, but then I got COVID, so I couldn't go, which is a bummer, but I'm still glad that I read this book. And so I did this one both with the physical book and also with the audiobook, and I think that's a really great way to consume this one because it's read by Louise Erdrich as well, and I really liked her sense of narration. She has a very like quiet, somewhat like understated voice, and it was a really interesting way of her kind of narrating this book. But basically we follow this woman named Tookie, and she is a woman who works at a bookstore that's owned by Louise Erdrich, and so it's kind of this meta auto-fictional sense in which we are basically placed in Louise Erdrich's bookstore, and there's a ghost that's haunting it. And so we follow this woman who I believe is in her 40s. She's indigenous, and she had recently gotten out of prison for a crime that she committed that was kind of a framing of her. And I won't spoil that. It's like right at the beginning of the book when you learn like why she went to prison and then how she gets out later. And then from there, we basically have this ghost story in terms of Tookie trying to figure out why this ghost, who was a frequent customer of the bookstore, why she's still haunting the bookstore. Also, the pandemic strikes, and so you see the ways that bookstores have to survive throughout the pandemic. And so this book overall felt like a huge love letter and ode to bookstores and bookselling. I think Louise Erdrich really does a good job at interspersing a lot of history about Indigenous people and how that also plays out within this context, particularly within the pandemic. And she uses the ghost story to kind of play with that, which I thought was really interesting. And as I frequent my local bookstore all the time, it was lovely reading a book that's set in a bookstore. I love like kind of a simple ghost story. It was just a very like wholesome read around the holidays. It was quite emotional at times, you know, given the pandemic that comes up, and also the George Floyd murder that's also featured prominently in this book near the end of it. And so this is a really cool and creative way, I think, for her to kind of reflect on the pandemic, and it doesn't really feel too soon. This is a book that I think really tackles the pandemic quite well by centering the narrative mostly in the bookstore and the ghost story there, and kind of having the pandemic be not in the background, but not really the forefront of this book. I really think it played well with creating an ode or a love letter to bookstores overall. So if you like your local bookstore, I would read this book. It's really wholesome, heartwarming, sad at times, funny, a little bit mysterious. It was just a good time. It feels like a really good, kind of like classic book that's set in modern times. So love that one. Next up is another book that ended up being in my top 10 of the year. It is You Never Get It Back by Cara Blue Adams. This is a short story collection that is interlinked. And so we have one woman named Kate who we see her throughout her entire life, but mostly within her 20s and then eventually in her 30s as she tries to discover herself, and she's also reckoning with family histories that are quite fraught. Her dad, oh no, I hope it's not blinding. I just realized the sun was coming in. I hope it's not looking terrible on the screen. But so we have a set of link stories, and we follow this one woman as she grapples with her sister and her mom and the relationships that they have, how she lost her father. Meanwhile, she's trying to figure out what career she wants. And I think thematically what is really at the root of this novel, it is a basically look at loss in all of its forms. We see many things that Kate loses throughout her life and the ways that she deals with that loss, particularly in the context of family, of friendship, of career loss, living with poverty as she was growing up, various relationships that she finds herself in, many of them which end for various reasons. And so this is a book deeply, deeply rooted in loss and grief, I would say. But I think what I really love so much about this book is that Cara Blue Adams is a debut book, and she just writes with such like perceptiveness and emotional acuity that it never feels like twee or sentimental at all. I think she's really good at distilling the essence of loss and the many feelings that kind of accompany that. I think she kind of opens up what it means to lose something and really reflect the many emotions that can come with that. Loss isn't something that's completely about sadness. I think loss can also be something that is freeing and can be happy in different lenses, and I think her use of various stories and looking at Kate at various different points in her life really plays into that really well. And so I haven't really read too many length story collections before, but this one really, really did it for me. I thought it was excellent and just very smartly done. And she uses a bunch of different structures and different perspectives and tenses here. And so I think it's a really great look at a debut writer who is blossoming, and I just thought it was brilliant. So highly recommend that one if you like short stories or just a linked focus on one woman as she's dealing with all of these things. Next up, I read another quite emotional book. I read These Precious Days by Patchett. This is an essay collection that is mostly rooted in thinking about death and loss as well. Kind of dark, but I think Patchett is such a stunning and precise, and again, like in that vein of like simplistic writers. She's not too flowery or poetic in her language, which I really like. I feel like every time I pick up something by her, I can kind of identify that it's Patchett because she writes with such like wisdom and joy, and she just seems like a lovely person to be around, and just a lovely person generally. She seems very like hopeful and positive. Again, not being too like sentimental in these various essays in which she's reflecting on her own personal history, and various things such as like her novels and knitting and what that means to her, and owning a bookstore as well. Interesting ties that I'm finding between these books now that I think about it. But the center of this collection is These Precious Days, in which she reflects on a friendship that she gained right before and then through the pandemic. She became friends with Tom Hanks's assistant, who then, when the pandemic struck, started to live with Patchett and her husband after she has been diagnosed with recurrent pancreatic cancer. And so you see Patchett enjoying the days that she has with her friend, who is one, battling cancer, and two, through the raging pandemic, what that means to kind of be under constant fear about losing someone close to you. Thinking about, these precious days, really thinking about how lucky we are to be here in the time that we have, and thinking about mortality and loss, and reflecting on personal history and how that informs how we appreciate what we have now. And it was just a really emotional, beautiful book. And I did this on audio as well, and I also had a galley from the publisher, so I did those concurrently. It's my thing lately. And Patchett reads it. She's an excellent narrator. I really like the kind of warmth that she brings to the narration here. Really shined. And so I think if you are looking for an essay collection on audio, definitely pick this one up. Every essay is so well written and just really well done. She's just a masterful writer, and she's iconic. She's a modern, iconic writer. And so definitely try that one if it sounds good to you. Okay, next up, I finally read the Copenhagen Trilogy by Tove Ditlevsen. This is one that I picked this up right before it made the top 10 books of New York Times books. What is the list called? The top 10 of New York Times books review. What? The top 10 New York Times books. Jesus. Okay, so I started this one right before that. I had been wanting to read this one for a while, and I kept seeing it at year-end lists, and I was like, okay, I need to finally do this. And so I picked it up, and I really, really liked it. It was a really interesting auto-fictional reflection of Tove Ditlevsen's kind of growing up in poverty around World War II, and what that means for a young woman who doesn't necessarily have much autonomy growing up in poverty, and also just being a woman in this time, and how she wants to, even from a child, wants to be a poet more than anything. And so this book, throughout these 3 short memoirs, she really reflects on her growth in becoming a poet and the various struggles that she had to go through to get there, and the men that she kind of had to ride the coattails of to get where she wanted to go, and what she had to sacrifice along the way. This is one that I also did on audio. It's on Scribd as well. And so I think one thing, I really love this book, but one thing that kind of didn't work for me too much is the narration. I don't know if this is intended, but I found that when listening to the narrator through childhood, then youth, then dependency, the last memoir, we see the narrator at different points in her life, but the narration style of the audiobook stayed the same throughout. And so I found that the narrator in childhood, the first one, she had a really good kind of like youthful delivery of the story, and so it worked really well. But then through youth, and then in dependency and adulthood, it stayed the same. And so I kind of felt like I was constantly listening to a more like youthful reading of the book, which was kind of odd to me. Like I wish there was maybe 3 different narrators, or if the narrator kind of changed their pitch or tone in the ways that they delivered the book, it would have been better. I hope that makes sense. It didn't really deter too much from the book, but I just thought that was interesting. I never really listened to an audiobook in the style of 3 different memoirs throughout someone's entire life, or most of their life, and so I don't know. That was kind of weird for me, but otherwise I really liked the explorations of childhood, the ways that the narrator here, which is basically Tove Ditlevsen, except it's autofictional, but reflecting on wartime and trying to become a poet in the various struggles she had to go through, including in the last one, which is the most harrowing and I would say depressing of them all, is she has a very dark battle with addiction, and the ways that her partner kind of played into her addiction and kind of didn't do much for her in terms of trying to help her with it, and how she grapples with that. And unfortunately, in real life, she committed suicide, I believe, in the 70s. but she does write with such kind of like restraint and very, again, I keep saying this in this video, but it's true of these books. It's very simplistic and direct, and I found that I really like that in my fiction lately, in terms of not really being too drawn to like more poetic or flowery language lately. I don't know what that is, but I just really liked the ways that through like autofiction, being able to distill your entire past in such a simple and like linear but concise way, which is a feat of kind of like memoir autofictional writing, if that makes sense. So I think the hype for this one is deserved. I'm a little bit surprised that it's being featured so prominently on year-end lists. Like, it didn't blow my mind per se, but I did think it was a really effective piece of memoir and autofictional writing. And I liked that it was a trilogy. It was really interesting, like seeing one character throughout different points in her life, and I think they all do stand on their own. And FSG, actually, they sell these three of the trilogy in different paperbacks, and I have them actually, and they're just stunning covers, and I know they're publishing more of her work this year. A story collection and then another short novel, I think, called The Faces. I liked it. And the last book that I read in 2021 was Dreaming of You by Melissa Lozada-Oliva. This is a novel told in verse, basically following, it's another autofictional book, which a woman named Melissa who resurrects Selena Quintanilla from the dead. And so I love that as a premise in terms of seeing a young poet in this book who feels such a strong affinity, like culturally, for Selena, and how so many young women, like Selena is like the idol, and what it means for young Latinx people to have Selena as like this, central idol for them growing up, and it's how it's such a focal point in so many Latinx people's identity growing up, and how she's so prevalent despite now being deceased. And so it's basically like a reckoning of Melissa with that idea as like the center point, but it also looks more so an examination of herself, I would say, through a variety of different poems. And I will say this book, I kind of felt mixed on it just because it has like the central theme of, or the central focus on like raising Selena from the dead, but it also plays with different poems that are a little bit more kind of like self-analytical and like abstract in a sense that I didn't really connect with too much, or I just felt kind of like confused by, I would say, in terms of the way that they were delivered. Like, she has some poems that I think structurally, I don't know what it's called, but like on the left side of the page is like a bunch of lines, and the right side of the page is a bunch of lines. And so you read it from the left down, and the right down, but then like across the page they also read together, if that makes sense. So I thought that was interesting, but sometimes I felt like the poems kind of flew over my head, to be honest. And yeah, I was kind of mixed on it. I love the ideas presented. I just don't know if the execution was really like my cup of tea, I would say. But I do think if you like Selena, if you want a more experimental, kind of dark novel, it's told in verse, a little bit different, experimental, I think you would like this one for sure. That about does it for my 2021 reading. I realized last year I didn't do a December wrap-up, and I was like, it's not happening this year. I want to just disregard the books that I read in December. So yeah, if you pick any of these up, if you've read any of these, let me know. If you like them, if you hated them, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you like my stuff, give me a like, give me a subscribe, leave a comment, say hello, follow me on my platforms below if you would like. And so I'll catch you in the next one. Bye.